everyone. Welcome to episode 225 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris.
And I'm Russell. I'm back.
We're so excited to have Russell back for the 5th annual Top 10 episode. So exciting. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me. I can't believe it's been 5 years.
Yeah, I looked it up. We started in 2020.
That is amazing.
Totally, it is. And so those of you who are new listeners to the Book Cougars, Russell is a fantastic booktuber. His channel is Ink and Paper Blog. We will link to his channel and all of his socials. And of course, every book that we mention in this episode will also appear in the show notes.
Yes.
So don't panic about writing things down, right?
I'm to the point where if you Google Ink and Paper Blog, my face shows up and it's kind of horrifying. I'm not sure I'm ready for it, but I'm easier to find on the interwebs than I ever thought I would be.
Well, we're glad you're there. And before we get started in our top 10s, which if you're also new to this top 10 episode, it should be 30 books in total. And often for some reason, there's more than 30. You'll find out. But Russell also just announced on his channel that he is making a big move. So for the first time ever, he is calling in from a different location.
That is true. I am currently on my way to Portland, Oregon to settle down for a new job and a new home. And the exciting thing is right near where we want to live, there is a spin-off Powell's bookstore that I can walk to. Every house we look at, I map quest to Powell's. I have my priorities straight, people.
Good.
Absolutely.
we never doubted you.
Well, Russell, would you like to kick us off and tell us one of your top 10 reads of 2024?
100%. I'm going to start with the shortest book that I think I read this year, but a book that I have been unable to forget. Put on my radar by the amazing Ryan at Read by Ryan on Instagram, sort of one of my bookish best friends. And that's The Most by Jessica Anthony, out from Little Brown. It's only 144 pages long, but I tell you right now, you will not forget this little book. I think it's set in 1957. Don't quote me on the year, but it's the story of a housewife that one Sunday gets up, her husband and children go to church. She gets in the pool and decides she's not going to leave the apartment pool. But it's much more than that. It's a dissection of the relationship between this husband and wife. The husband fears that his secret has gotten out and is scared to return home. The wife has plenty of secrets of her own that her husband doesn't even know exist. And it's just this one day, and you sort of flash back in their relationship. But I tell you what, you won't forget The Most by Jessica Anthony. You just won't.
Yippee! We also play a game where some of us don't put things on our list because we're hoping that somebody else did, and that's one for me. Thank you so much for choosing The Most. I loved that book too.
And it was a paperback original. It didn't even come out in hardback, and it was longlisted for the National Book Award. So don't trust me, don't trust Emily, trust the National Book Award people.
There you go. Yes.
I personally trust the two of you more. Anyway. No shade to the National Book Award judges.
Chris, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm not doing these in any particular order. I have them written on little half index cards, but I do have to say, I think the last three are kind of up there. So I have some kind of an order. My first book, it's Thirst by Marina Yazchuk. It was translated by Heather Cleary. This originally came out in 2020, but I believe the translation came out this year from Dutton. I had mixed feelings about this book when I read it. It's a vampire novel set in 2 time periods. It's a vampire who comes from Europe. She's tired of all of the bloody wars and everything in Europe. She stows away on a ship and lands on the shores of Buenos Aires when it was just a tiny little struggling seaport town. She watches it grow up into this cosmopolitan city into the 20th, 21st century. through that time, she learns how to control herself and not just go around ripping people's throats out and things like that. So I enjoyed that aspect of it, the historical look at some major city as it grows with this vampire. There's not a ton of detail about that, but it's just enough so that you understand kind of what's going on. The other character who comes along is a woman who is in a cemetery and she's sad, and these two women connect, the vampire woman and the human woman, and they have this passion between the two of them. And I don't want to give any spoilers or anything, but there were things about the novel that I didn't appreciate, but as I think about it more and more, I'm ready to reread it. And I read it as an e-arc, which sometimes reading an e-book, I have problems with remembering things that I probably wouldn't have issues with if it were a paper book. I plan on rereading this one. I was going to already this year, but I thought just hold back a little bit more. But it's really stuck with me. You could even say it has been haunting me since I read it. That is Thirst by Marina Yazchuk.
Well, I had two favorite memoirs this year. An exact replica of A Figment of My Imagination by Elizabeth McCracken. This pubbed in 2008, and I happened upon a copy of it on like a free shelf walking out of a library when I was in Provincetown, Massachusetts. This is a very short book, Russell, a lot like The Most. It was like 180 pages or something. And it's about, in her 9th month of pregnancy, her baby had died. And she's living in rural France, and she tells the story of the loss of that child, but then also moving with her husband back to the States and getting pregnant again and having another baby almost exactly a year to the day that she lost her first child. And you'd think it'd be really sad, but her writing is so beautiful. And she really tells the story about grief and how there are certain people in your life who can help you through your grief and certain people who don't. So it was kind of a master class in how to talk to people who are grieving the loss of a child as well, which I found really interesting. And then the other memoir was Between Two Kingdoms, a memoir of a life interrupted by Suleika Jawad. This starts where she's just a college graduate. She's living in Paris. She should be living the good life. She's in her early 20s. And all of a sudden, she starts to get really tired. It just doesn't seem right considering her age. She goes to the doctor to find out she has cancer and has to go back home to the United States and ends up spending a good 4 years in hospital. And during the time that she's in the hospital, she starts to write a column for the New York Times. She gets quite a following, and a lot of people reach out to her. And when she's ready to leave the hospital, you'd think she'd be ready to take off into her life again, but she finds it really hard to adjust. She learns to drive. She didn't know how to drive. She learns to drive. She adopts a mutt named Oscar, and she takes off on a 15,000-mile road trip across the United States where she meets people that have written to her in response to these articles in the New York Times, the columns in the New York Times. It's a really beautiful memoir. If you don't know, she's also the wife of the musician Jon Batiste. And there's a great documentary about them called American Symphony. It was really to just be about Jon Batiste's writing of a new symphony, but it coincided with her going back into the hospital. It's just a beautiful documentary. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. There I am, sneaking in 2 books.
Cheater.
I was about to say, like, you didn't even wait a minute. You were like,
yeah.
I'm just going to do it.
I know.
I'm just going to do it from the get-go and go from there.
Yeah.
So,
setting the stage.
Oh, fair. So every year I read one book, which I call my hug for the heart. It's just that book that just makes me feel good. That book this year was Sipsworth by Simon Van, and his last name is Booy. And I just want to, I don't know how that's actually said. I want to say boo because it seems like boo, but I don't know what the Y does to it. This is out from Godine, who I had never heard of until I picked up this book. If you have followed me at all or listened to these, you know I have just a love for books about old women. It's my sweet spot. And this is the story of a woman. She's probably in her 70s. She's returned to the small town in England that she's from. She's lived abroad for a long period of time. You find out very soon that her husband has died and her son died tragically. And so she's come home basically for the end of her life. She's like got nothing that she's really living for anymore. One night she hears some noise outside her door. She goes outside and someone has thrown away an animal cage and she brings it inside, and inside of it is a little mouse that she names Sipsworth. The story takes off from her deciding that she's going to take care of this mouse. And what winds up happening is she investigates how to do that. She meets people. She meets the town librarian and her son. She meets a man at a hardware store that helps her set up a home for Sipsworth. And it becomes about the relationships that the taking care of Sipsworth introduces to her and gives her a reason to continue to see the world as a place to live in versus just a place to end her life. I will tell you, I bawled at the end of this book. It ends perfect. It just ends perfect. And it's everything you need from a book that's just about living life to its fullest. Even when you think that maybe it's over, it's not. Something can happen. So, Sipsworth by Simon Van Boey from Godine, and it's short too. It's only 240 pages.
Great. I think this was the year of short books for me, like a love of short books.
Yeah.
That's cool. That so far you're 2 for 2 on the short ones.
Well, my next one is a short one as well, and it's an older book, Summer by Edith Wharton. This came out in 1917, and it was such a surprise. This book is known as the Hot Ethan Frome. Emily and I, last year was our year of reading romance. And so when we first heard that this was the Hot Ethan Frome, my mind went to sexy hot. No, this is just taking place in summer, as the title tells you. Ethan Frome in the winter. This is a story of a young woman named Charity Royale. This novel is known as her Hot Ethan Frome, and it deals with such contemporary issues to what we're still dealing with today. Incest, abortion. There's actually an abortionist in this novel, which really surprised me. I think it's the first time in earlier, like this is early 20th century, 1917. It's still shocking though, that she wrote about this so openly. So Charity is living in this small town in Massachusetts, and she really wants more. She was adopted by a well-off couple. The mother died pretty early, and there are hill folk who live up in the hill. It made me think a lot about Southern literature, people living up in the holler or the mountains, mountain people. So there's that tension between the town people, the mountain people, and this young woman who was coming of age, and as so many teenagers do, thinks she knows everything and that she's going to be different. It's a really bleak book in a lot of ways. And I did it as a buddy read with Sean from Sean Breed's Books, Dorian, and James. And the 4 of us had a really great conversation about it. It's just such a frank conversation about issues, even for a reader today. So again, that's Summer by Edith Wharton. And I did read Ethan Frome. I reread it before reading Summer. And it was really great to read them together in that way.
I had 2 favorite historical novels.
Damn, Emily.
One is called The Frozen River by Ariel Lahan. This takes place in a very wintry Hallowell, Maine in 1789, when a man is discovered entombed in ice in a frozen Kennebunk River. And Martha Ballard is the local town midwife, and she is an avid journal keeper. And just before this man is found dead, had written about alleged rape that had taken place. And the man that's found dead was one of the men named in the rape. The book takes off from there. Martha is the main protagonist, and she is based on a real midwife. And there's a book about her called A Midwife's Tale that's nonfiction, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1991. And I gave this book to my daughter's midwife as a thank you. And she said when she was in midwifery school, they read A Midwife's Tale, and she was really excited to read this historical fiction based on Martha Ballard. There's a little bit of a trial aspect to it, but I have to say the thing that I enjoyed the most about the novel was just the relationships with all of the people in this small town of Hollowell, and particularly the marriage at the center, Martha and her husband. And then the other historical novel I loved was The Women by Kristen Hanna. I'd never read a Kristen Hanna. I know people are huge fans of hers. And this is about Frankie McGrath, who was raised in Southern California by her very conservative parents. Her brother goes off to the Vietnam War, and Frankie decides to join as a nurse in the Army Nurse Corps. The novel is very well researched and talks to the fact that the nurses saw so much action in the Vietnam War. It was a much different kind of action, obviously, than if you were on the front lines fighting. But also that when they came home, people didn't think that women had been in the Vietnam War at all. And so Frankie is struggling with PTSD and goes to the VA to try to talk to someone. And they're like, there were no women in the Vietnam War. So Kristen Hanna really takes that on in this novel, and the audiobook was really good as well. I did a hybrid read of the paper and the audio. That's The Women by Kristen Hanna and The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. Sorry, y'all. I'm in a cheaty kind of mood.
I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to creatively put two books together because I brought my 11, but I'm just going to have to be like, nope, I got 11. So that's how we're going to do it. I will say this was a year where a lot of established authors put out books, and sometimes that's a blessing and sometimes that's a curse. This year was a real blessing for me. A lot of the books by people that I was really waiting for really stood out to me this year. And the next book I want to talk about is Rachel Khong's Real Americans, which came out from Knopf this year. Now, Rachel Khong wrote Goodbye Vitamin, which was one of my favorite short books of a few years ago. It was very, very tiny. And Real Americans is my favorite cover of the year. If you haven't seen the cover of this book, it is absolutely gorgeous. This is the story of a family. It's told through the eyes of three members of a family over three different time periods. It starts, I think, with Lily during the Y2K moment. She's just out of college. She's an intern and she works for this company doing journalism. She meets a wealthy man, and it's how that man and that relationship changes her life and how money can change your life in a lot of ways. The second section of the book is told from the perspective of her son. They've now moved to Washington. Her son does not know his father very well. You'll find out why if you read the book. But he's about to graduate high school and go to college and starts a relationship with his father where he learns the power of money, similar to what his mom did. And then the third section is told slightly in the future, but it's actually the section about Lily's mom, who she and her husband moved here from China to flee the revolution. She was a scientist in China and she came here, and it's about everything she did to get her family started. It has some intricacies with the science and some of the things that were going on. And what happens is the grandmother is moved to Washington and finds the grandson and is sort of watching him. And he finds her one day and says, "Why don't I know you?" And learns her story and why they all sort of who they are and where they've gone. And Rachel Khong can write a book. Like, she just can write a book. And the characters were so well lived in my brains, and I really felt with them. Money is actually a big theme this year for me in a lot of books, and the power of money and actually the poison of money in a lot of ways. And I think Real Americans tackled that in a very interesting family saga type of way. Real Americans, Rachel Khong, highly recommend.
Yeah, that book had such an interesting structure, didn't it?
Yeah.
It was almost like it was told backwards. It's hard to describe, but yeah.
It's a great audiobook too, by the way.
My next book is a romance. I had such a fun time exploring the romance genre this year. In the past, I haven't been a big romance reader, and this year I'm a convert. Let's just put it that way. I will be reading romance going forward. There were three that really stood out to me, and I'll just say quickly, We Got the Beat by Jenna Miller. Great YA about two girls in high school, volleyball player and a reporter on the school newspaper. And then A Little Bit Country by Brian Kennedy, which is our fourth quarter read along about two young men in Nashville in the music scene and restaurant business. But I think my favorite romance of the year is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. This actually came out in 2020 from Source Books. And I listened to the audio, which is narrated by Joe Jameson, and he did such a fantastic job with all of the voices. I mean, this novel has such vivid characters, which is one of the things I really loved. Joe did such a great job with all the different accents and attitudes of these characters. It has great humor, and the chemistry between the two main characters was so believable to me. It's about two guys who both need to be seen in a stable relationship. One of the guys basically needs to save his job to be, well, let me just say he's a fundraiser in a nonprofit. There were some pictures in the media of him not looking very good. The donator base is very conservative. The boss is like, you need to clean it up and look like you're in a stable relationship and not some drunken playboy. And then the other character does not want to go to his parents' anniversary party by himself because he's always the single one. And his sibling is, of course, the magical child who has a great relationship. So these two, it's a fake dating setup. And the ins and outs were just fantastic. I didn't think I would like a fake dating setup because it seems so, fake. But this novel was ridiculous in parts, but so believable. And I loved the characters. Again, that's Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall.
My favorite romance of the year was The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle by Matt Cain. And part of what made it my favorite, Chris, also was it was an audiobook and it was narrated by Simon Vance. And he did such a great job of bringing the story to life, which is about Albert Entwistle, who is a postmaster in a small town in England. And he finds out that at the age of 64, they're going to make him retire. And he's really kept to himself. He doesn't even talk to anybody on his route when he's delivering the mail. He has a cat that he loves, and the cat gets sick and passes away. And he realizes, like, ooh, when I stop going to work, I'm going to have a very lonely life. So he starts to come out of his shell. As he does that, you learn about his backstory, that part of why he shut down in life is that he had a great love in high school with a young man he was in school with, and the relationship was completely shut down. And not only that, it was a time when gay men were getting into a lot of trouble with the law and being put in jail. And his father just so happened to be a police officer. So it was really bad news for Albert. And as he starts to come out of his shell at the age of 64, some of his new friends encourage him to find this man that was the love of his life. And so it's a great second chance later in life romance. And as I said, Simon Vance totally brought the story to life. It's called The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle.
And I can support both those choices. I loved both Boyfriend Material and The Secret Life of Albert. Both of those are very, very good, very different books, but definitely very, very good. So support that. So my next book is Hombrecito by Santiago Jose Sanchez, out from Riverhead. I will say this was like one of those things that happened where it was like a checklist for any booktuber, because Riverhead reached out to me and asked to interview me for this book for their newsletter. So I got to be in the Riverhead newsletter, which was so exciting for me. Like, you're a bookish nerd when you're in a Riverhead newsletter, and that's the apex of your year. So Hombrecito is a debut novel. It is about a young boy, his mom, and his brother in Colombia. He has a very distant father, so his mom decides to move the whole family to the United States. They first move to Florida, where they have some family, and then he moves on to New York, where he sort of has his queer coming out. And the book is so real about the queer coming out experience. Sometimes I feel like that experience can be rather glorified in some ways. This is very real, very raw, very good. But what winds up happening is his mom becomes fairly distant and then reaches out and invites him to go back to Colombia to sort of find closure with his father and see some family. And he returns to there and finds out that maybe his mom has some secrets that they explain what happened. His dad may not be as distant, and he meets a man and what happens there. So it's a beautiful debut novel. It is fantastically told. The characters are rich. I feel like this new generation of writers are all poets as well, and you can really see that in their writing. So I highly recommend Hombrecito by Santiago Jose Sanchez out from Riverhead.
Sounds really good.
Yes. Well, my next book was just a really fun read. River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile by Candace Millard. This came out in 2022 from Doubleday. It's just a good old-fashioned adventure tale. It's about Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke in the 19th century. They are going on that classic British expedition into Africa to find the source of the Nile. And I actually didn't know that that was like a big unknown at one time. They're white men. Millard addresses the racist, colonialism, imperialism issues, but she depicts these guys going in for months at a time, years, I think, actually, they're gone for sometimes, walking into the jungles of Africa with teams of people supporting them, usually locals, but just the disease that they faced, the fevers that they had, the political issues that came up in some areas. One of the areas they were walking through was ruled by a queen who kind of didn't let them pass for a while. I just find it so fascinating that they're going into an area, they don't know the languages. They don't know anything. I don't know. It just seems like a big leap of faith to do that. And also huge, egotistical, narcissistic, imperialist situation, obviously. But the way she wrote about it, she brought both of these characters to life, both of these men. They were real people, I should say. But as characters within the story, the way she presents them and the tension between them was just so well done. I don't know if this has been made into a movie, but I felt like I could visualize everything as the tale was unfolding. So again, that was River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile by Candace Millard. She has a couple other nonfiction books out about different rivers, and they're definitely on my TBR.
Well, I found a favorite new to me author this year, Monica Wood, who lives in Maine. And the first book of hers that I read that I loved was How to Read a Book. And it has 3 character points of view. One is Violet Powell, who's a 22-year-old in jail. And she's in jail for a DUI where she killed the local kindergarten teacher when she was driving drunk. And then the next character is Harriet. She's a retired English teacher, and she runs the book club at the local prison where Violet is. And then Frank Daigle, who is kind of a Mr. Fix-It and works at the local bookstore and also happens to be the husband of the woman who was killed by Violet in the DUI accident. And it's one of those stories where you put 3 characters together that, you wouldn't think would come together, and it's second chances and found family and friends. And I just loved the story, loved the writing, loved the idea of people who mess up having a second chance. And it wasn't done like in a light touch kind of way. It was very real. And then the other book of hers I read was The 1 in a Million Boy, which I guess came out before How to Read a Book, and it was very popular. And it's about an 11-year-old Boy Scout who's helping a 104-year-old woman, Russell, in her yard, doing yard work and helping her out. And she starts to share her backstory with him. And then he gets it in his craw that he wants her to win a Guinness Book of World Records for living the longest. But she has some stiff competition. And it's a real feel-good novel. And also, both of the novels actually deal with quite a bit of grief as well. So that's Monica Wood, How to Read a Book, and The 1 in a Million Boy.
So if I had a top 15, How to Read a Book would have been in it because I read that this year and absolutely loved it. I hate the title, but I think the book is worth every minute you'll spend with it, and it is a fantastic audio. So Highly recommend. All that heart crying tear stuff is so good in that one.
What didn't you like about the title? Is it just because it sounds like nonfiction-y?
Because I don't think it really had anything to do with it. Like it sounds like it's going to be one thing, and it's not. The book part of the book is so small compared to everything else in it. But yeah, no, it's a brilliant little book. So
Yeah.
I really, really loved it. So every year I have a book on my list that I think is one for Chris and one for Emily. And this is the Chris book this year. And it is called The Safekeep by Yale van der Wooden. And it is set just after World War II in Amsterdam. And it's the story of a woman. She is the only sister of three siblings. She lives in the family home. She's a reclusive woman. She doesn't really have any friends. She's sort of known as like a taskmaster. One of her brothers is gay and sort of has this secret gay relationship everyone knows, but no one talks about. And then the other brother is sort of like the philanderer. Like he brings a different woman home every Christmas, every holiday. And they get together for dinner and he's brought home his new love of his life. And then 2 weeks later, he brings her to the house and says, I'm leaving her with you. I need you to watch her because I have to go out of the country. I say this is like a weird World War II single white female sort of thing that goes on. The women have decided they'll hate each other until that becomes clear that that's not what's going to happen. But I will say, you find out the family got this house because of certain things that were going on during World War II. And maybe there's more story as to why this other woman is there than we all thought. And we find out that maybe our sister character, and I apologize, I'm terrible with names and I don't have any books with me right now, but maybe she's a little bit cold because she's never allowed herself to fall in love because of what that would mean in this time period. It gets weirdly obsessive and sort of crazy, but then it turns on a dime and it's so good. Chris, you will absolutely love it. Promise. Take my word for it. The Safekeep by Jelle van der Wooden. It's out from Avid Reader Press here in the US. It's not long. It's 272 pages. So,
All right, I'm on it. Thank you, Russell.
That one has a funny cover for what it's about, doesn't it?
it's almost like a Dutch painting. So it's a still life, which eventually makes sense as you read the book. It's definitely worth it.
I've seen that cover so much, but as you're saying what it's about, I'm like, that doesn't seem right. That's so interesting.
Well, I just spread out my little index cards and I'm like, I don't know what to pick. I'm going to pick a biography, The Dragon from Chicago, The Untold Story of an American Reporter in Nazi Germany. This is by Pamela D. Toller. It came on last year, 2024, from Beacon Press. And we actually had Pamela on. She was our last guest of the year. Great way to end the year. This book is one that we were both looking forward to for quite a while. It's about Sigrid Schultz, who was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune during World War II. It's a biography. It does go into her background, her childhood, her family relations, and things like that. She was born in Chicago, but raised primarily in Europe. So she had fantastic language skills. She spoke something like 3 languages fluently, and then I think a total of 7. I think it was, she can kind of hold her own in. So she is there during World War I. She's there during the rise of the Nazis. And because she knows German culture so well, she makes an excellent reporter. But I think one of the things is she didn't imagine herself as a reporter. She was a teacher. She landed in this role by accident, you could say, but she really ran with it and contributed so much to the understanding of the rise of the Nazis. And one of the things we both appreciated about this book and Sigrid's work is that she was so immersed in the culture and she was there for so long that it just really speaks the importance of depth and longevity in understanding a culture and what's going on and the changes and how those changes are being implemented and what they do to people. So I just really was fascinated by her work and enjoyed this book so much. And World War II primarily is the focus, but I am just so blown away by her work and that we didn't hear about her, you know? So many of the books that I love are about women who've made such big impacts, who have been forgotten. I don't want to say left out of history. They've been swept out of history. They've never been put into history. And she's one that more people, I hope, will read about. Again, that's The Dragon from Chicago by Pamela D. Toller.
Well, if I had to pick a top book of the year, this would probably be it. This is the author who I would want to be friends with if I had the chance, and that's Catherine Newman and her novel Sandwich. I also read her novel We All Want Impossible Things this year because I loved Sandwich so much. And Sandwich is about a family who has gone to the same house on Cape Cod for 20 years, the same cottage, spending the same week. They have children, so the children have been raised going to this cottage, and then her parents also come for part of the week. And it's really just about the ins and outs of spending time with your family and how she speaks with her children, the losses she's had because she had some miscarriages and how that's woven into the story. It's very funny and very sad. And when an author can do that, it's amazing to me. I mean, you will cry, you will laugh. Her writing is very familiar in a way that I really appreciate. Her book, We All Want Impossible Things, is about two best friends, one of whom is dying in her 40s and ends up in hospice care. And the time spent together sharing memories because these were two best friends that grew up together. Both of the novels are just beautiful. Both of them, Russell, are incredibly short. I want to say they're like 220 pages or so. I loved them both, and I would stalk Catherine Newman if she lived near me, so she's lucky she doesn't.
Sandwich has been on my radar, so definitely we'll have to pick it up. I am getting into some longer books, y'all, just so you know. It's I've gotten through most of my short ones, though one coming up is very, very short. But the next book I want to talk about is Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst that came out this year. Now, Alan Hollinghurst won the Booker for, is it called A Line of Beauty, I believe is the name of his book. He is one of the Mount Rushmores of gay literature. His face would be up there. But he's had some books that haven't gotten the best reception lately, and this was really called his return to form. So Our Evenings is the story of one man's life. We meet him. His name is David. He's half Burmese, half British. His mom was a seamstress, and he got a scholarship from a very wealthy family to a private boarding school. At the start of the book, the man who gave him that scholarship has passed away. And it's about how that relationship formed David. And again, how money can change the course of someone's life. The couple that sponsored him have a son who is currently a very conservative MP who is going the whole Brexit route and the anti-immigration route. But David and he grew up together. And the book goes back to when they met and just goes through time. David is a queer man. He's coming into his own. He has his own relationships. And we follow that. He becomes an actor. And it talks a lot about how through time, what he is typecast as changes. He's the brown man to start his career. And at the end of his career, he's the old man, only seen in certain ways, and how that affects him. It's about his relationship with the man he finds that's the love of his life. And it ends tragically. And it is heartbreaking. It is a bit of a beast. It's almost 500 pages, but it is a beautiful audiobook if you are looking for something like that. And to me, it's almost perfect. It is a very, very good book.
Wow. I'm always fascinated when people say a book is perfect or near perfect. Because one I want to read this year is Philip Roth's Ghostwriter. A friend recently said that she thinks that's a near perfect novel as well. So I'm kind of curious about that. Russell, like, what makes it perfect for you?
The ability to capture a single person's life in such poetic terms and show how life is not one-dimensional. However, at times you can find a common theme in your life if you take a moment. And I think, Chris, there's a lot of stuff when you're a member of the queer community, you're always looking in on what the way society has perceived you or how you are allowed to be perceived yourself. And this book just does that, but empowers the main character to be himself as well, which I think in the time period that this took place, that takes real guts and gumption. It's hard to be authentically yourself now, but I couldn't imagine through time. But it's really beautiful.
Sounds really good. That's one I'm going to add to my TBR for sure. Well, the next book I'm going to talk about is also another biography. I had a great year with them. The Vanishing of Carolyn Wells, Investigations into a Forgotten Mystery Author. This is by Rebecca Rigo Berry. And it came out from Post Hill Press in 2024. And Carolyn Wells, her dates were 1862 to 1942. And she was known for a lot of different reasons, but she was a really well-known popular mystery writer who wrote locked room mysteries a decade before Agatha Christie. And she's not on the radar anymore of most readers. And look at Agatha Christie, you know, everyone knows her name. She's probably, is she the most read woman writer? I think I read something, a statistic like that.
She could be. I mean, everyone knows her, so.
Right, yeah, and she's been translated everywhere. So the thing with Carolyn Wells is that she had such a diverse body of work. She wrote in different genres. She had a game named after her. A lot of different areas she had her fingers in. So it was really interesting to read that, and the way the book was structured, it was by Carolyn Wells's different creative output. And that was a neat way to approach her life. Again, that was The Vanishing of Carolyn Wells by Rebecca Rigo Berry.
And she also did crossword puzzles. She was like the early maker of puzzles that we all now play.
Yes, yeah, totally. I mean, and that's what she did as a kid a lot, was doing puzzles. And then that's what she made a living at for a while.
So my most used cookbook this year was The Cookie That Changed My Life and more than 100 other classic cakes, cookies, muffins, and pies that will change yours by Nancy Silverton and Carolyn Carrero. And Nancy Silverton is like the goat of pastry baking. During the pandemic, her husband brought her home a peanut butter cookie made by Roxana Jolipat, who is a baker that trained with Nancy Silverton. And she was like, that's the best peanut butter cookie I've ever had, but I want to make it better. And during the pandemic, she set off to make an even better peanut butter cookie. And then she took all of your classic recipes, you know, baking, pastry recipes, and made them the best that you could make them. But one thing I love about this cookbook is they're not all her recipes. Just like she did with this cookie, she goes and she says, well, my friend makes the best gingerbread cake, so I'm going to take her recipe, give her a nod in the cookbook, and then tell you how I tweak it a little bit. And I have checked this book out of the library so many times and maybe stained a few pages here and there. I highly recommend, if you like to bake, that you check it out yourself. Again, it's called The Cookie That Changed My Life by Nancy Silverton.
Okay, well, I do like a cookie.
I only did one cookbook, y'all. I could have done 10 cookbooks.
So now's the time where I'm going to throw out one of the heavyweights of American letters, and I'm going to talk about Tell Me Everything by Elizabeth Strout. Is there a better writer about small town America than Elizabeth Strout? I just don't think there is. In her simplicity, she is so complicated. Like, she says more with 4 words than some people need 10 pages. And Tell Me Everything it's really a combination of so many things. Olive Kitteridge and Lucy Barton come together and meet. It's the story of Bob Burgess, I believe is his name. He's really the main character. He's a retired attorney up there in Maine. There is a woman's body found in a lake in a car, and he decides to defend the man who has been accused of it. It is his mother. He's been accused of the murder. But it's really about this town in Maine and the people. If you read it alone for the moments where Olive and Lucy are in the same space and they are coming together, She writes two powerful women that are so significantly different and then allows them to own their own uniqueness. It's just phenomenal. Like, there's just no one like her. Does it stand alone? It does, but it really does benefit from having read the Olive books. And Random House sent this to me with this giant grid of how all of Elizabeth Strout's books come together. And I don't know how she does it. So if you haven't read Elizabeth Strout, I think you're missing out on probably, in my argument, one of the great American writers currently writing. You will laugh, you will cry, you will be heartbroken. I just love her so much. Every time I read her, I just feel safe.
And My Name is Lucy Barton. So that's who Russell is referring to. That was a novel she wrote also, and that's the Lucy that appears in this one, right?
Yes.
And then there's the Burgess boys, right?
Yes.
So,
and Bob Burgess is the attorney in the Burgess Boys.
okay.
And Lucy Barton's a series too. It's a number of books, and then all of Kittredge's two books together as well. So they're all sort of connected. They're all powerful, and they're just amazing.
I haven't read it yet because I couldn't remember if I'd read the Burgess boys, so I wanted to go back and check before I read that one. So it's on my list, but I'm glad to hear that you loved it.
They're all short, so you could
Yes.
potentially do a reread. And
Yes.
you know.
I will say that Tell Me Everything is the longest of them all, just so you know, but you'll,
Yes.
But by long, like what, like 300 pages?
it's just over 350 pages, I
Okay,
think.
yeah. Because long for her is.
Yeah, that's long for her. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, my next book is a novel, but also one about a woman who more people need to know about, a woman in history, Margaret Fuller. This book is Finding Margaret Fuller by Alison Pataki. And this came out in 2024 from Ballantine Books. It's historical fiction. Margaret Fuller was a feminist. She's kind of like the grandmother of American feminism. In the 19th century, she was an educator, a writer, a thinker. She was also a foreign correspondent. She was in Europe. She was in Italy during their revolution and sent reports into the newspapers. And this novel really kind of covers Margaret Fuller's life as an adult. We don't really get her childhood. It's more about her as a young woman struggling to make it on her own in Boston. She's in Concord for a while. She was great friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he considered her the greatest mind in America at the time, the most well-read person. So she was very philosophical, and her writing is sometimes hard. Pataki doesn't go into that. But what I appreciated is that the whole force of the novel wasn't about her finding a man, because Margaret Fuller does end up with finding a lover in Italy, and it's unknown whether they actually married or not, but they did have a child together, and tragically the three of them died when they were returning to the United States. They died in a shipwreck. So a lot of those details are lost. What I really appreciated about this novel is that it really gives you an idea of what her life was like as a single woman trying to make it as an intellectual in her day. But then she did have a really great international impact as well. So when she's in Europe, there are famous people in Europe who can't wait to meet her and are thrilled by that. So I'm hoping a lot of people read this book. And if you haven't yet and you're interested in learning about a great American woman, sometimes doing it through fiction, I think is a great way for people to get exposure. And I'm so excited that this came. The Library of America, they are putting out, this is coming out in February, the collected writings of Margaret Fuller. So I think the novel from Alison Pataki and then these collected writings would make a good pair. So again, that's Finding Margaret Fuller by Alison Pataki.
I loved that novel too, and I was hoping it would be on your list. Phew. So my last book, y'all, because I combined some, is There's Always This Year on Basketball in Ascension by Hanif Abdurraqib. This one squeaked in. I read it December 30th and December 31st, so I'm glad we didn't record early this year. I would also say this is probably the top audiobook I listened to this year. He narrates and he does a beautiful job. He also is a poet, Russell, so he reads it somewhat like in poetic fashion. Hanif Abdurraqib is a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant awardee. We got to see him because he won a Wyndham Campbell Award this year as well. He's also been homeless at points in his life, and he talks about that in this book. The book weaves stories of his youth and going to watch LeBron James play basketball because they were a similar age. So Hanif was a young man growing up in Columbus, Ohio, when LeBron James was wowing people in Akron, Ohio. So he weaves stories of LeBron's ascension and Hanif's ascension as well as he grows and learns lessons. And then also the effect of LeBron James leaving when he chose to leave the Cleveland Cavaliers and move down to Miami because he wasn't winning the big one playing for Cleveland. His writing is freaking brilliant. I loved it so much, and I'm so glad that I listened to him read it. Again, it's called There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension by Hanif Abdurraqib. And I would also say seeing him in person at the Beinecke read live was one of my highlight biblio adventures this year with Chris as well.
To piggyback on what you said, the next book that I'm going to talk about is called Universality by Natasha Brown. It was my last read of the year. I read it on the 31st. It's only 176 pages. It doesn't come out until I think March of this year. Natasha Brown has written 2 books now. She was one of Granta's best novelists under 35 in Britain a few years ago. This book starts as a journalist's article, an investigation into an attack on a man at a commune at a farm in rural England. It's about a man who gets beaten in the head with a gold bar. It turns into this investigation to find the man who committed the act. And you find that, and that is just the first section. And it's just like an investigation. So you sort of learn this mystery and why all these pieces. Then each section thereafter is a character that you have met in the investigation. We start with the author of the article. We find out how she was sort of nobody, and then she found this article. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's pretty amazing. You have a woman who is a writer, like an Ann Coulter type character in England. You find out her relationship to the people involved in the act and what she has been doing to manipulate the scene so that she gets her own fame from everything that's going on. This book is all about the power of words. Words as commerce, words as currency, words as weapons, and words as instigators for action, both positive and negative. It is short, but it packs one heck of a punch. It ended and I was like, what, just no, but worth every page. It comes out in March again, I think March of this year, and it's Universality by Natasha Brown. Highly recommend.
I want to read that. That sounds
so good.
Very cool. Well, my next book is another nonfiction, Trial by Ambush, Murder and Justice and the Truth About the Case of Barbara Graham. This is by Marcia Clark. It came out in 2024 from Thomas and Mercer. You know, I'm not a true crime reader. It scares me. It freaks me out. When I was a bookseller, I used to hate to shelve that section because the covers were all scary and made me have nightmares about serial killers and stuff. And this is a true crime book, but it's really looking at the trial of Barbara Graham, who was accused of murder and was on death row in the 50s. There have been movies made about her and other books written about Barbara Graham, but no one ever really looked into the trial, the actual trial of her. She was tried along with 2 men who were hardened criminals, and Barbara Graham was a kind of a petty criminal. So for her to be tried for this brutal murder, she was also an attractive looking woman. So it was a sensational trial. A lot of it focused on her and her looks. It gave you that femme fatale kind of vibe. You know, the public is primed for that. The newspapers covered it as if it was that kind of situation. So I'm not sure if I'm going to rush out and read a lot of true crime, but I do think that Marcia Clark has set a high bar for true crime going forward. She's a very experienced lawyer, and she inserts herself in the book here and there at very appropriate times to explain situations she's been in as a lawyer or someone in the legal profession and mistakes that she made or things that she learned. It works really well because it helps bring that 1950s trial to today in a lot of ways. Because a lot of things have changed legally. There are things that the prosecutors wouldn't have gotten away with today. There's also laws that have changed since then. But I found it to be very gripping. And I have to say, pleasantly surprised. This is also a book that our buddy John Valeri was a research assistant for. He did a lot of tracking down of things in the archives and newspapers. So it's very much based on primary evidence. And I love that kind of stuff. So again, that's Trial by Ambush by Marcia Clark.
I love that one too. And it reminds me, I want to watch the movie. There's not a movie called Trial by Ambush, but there's a movie about her that won an Academy Award, right?
Yeah, I started it one night and I just couldn't handle it because it's so that dramatic overacting of the time period. And I'm like, whoa, I'm just not in the mood for that tonight. So just be warned about that. But like, it's a very, she won awards for her performance and a lot of people love it. But I think I just personally needed to be in the mood for that kind of movie.
Yeah. All right, Russell. I did all my cheating ahead of time, so
I have my top three, everything else, but these really were the three books that sat with me for the year. So let's talk about Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. Sally Rooney is one of my favorite authors. She is an Irish writer. She can do no wrong. I know that she doesn't play well for everybody, but to me, she just writes so beautifully. This is the story of two brothers. At the very beginning of the book, their father has passed away, and they're both dealing with the grief in different ways. One brother is a professor. He is sort of in two relationships, one with a woman he has known for his whole life, who he truly loves, but she has had an accident and is unable to give him everything she thinks he needs for a successful relationship. So he's got the emotional relationship with her. And then he's also dating a young college co-ed who's giving him the physical side of what he needs. And he may be underestimating what she brings to the table. The other brother is sort of a chess champion. He's a little bit awkward, a little bit odd. He's younger by a good amount of years than his brother. And he goes to a small town to do a chess tournament and meets an older woman who's in the process of getting a divorce. And they start a relationship. And it's about how these brothers are dealing with the grief of losing their father, but at the same time trying to find their way through relationships and complications. And then the dynamic of the two of them, you know, that older brother, younger brother thing that worked so well when they were growing up has turned into tension, and one does not understand the other. And the older brother's sort of dismissiveness towards his younger brother's relationship really causes an animosity that almost is unable to be overcome. It's just really about these two brothers and dealing with life. It's about the chess moves we make to get through life, to be happy by the time we reach the end of the board. So that's Intermezzo by Sally Rooney.
Oh, I was curious about that one.
I cannot read her. I've tried, but I'll have to try again.
Oh.
Listen to her.
Okay, I'll try that. That's a good. And would you start with this one, or would you start with a different one?
I will tell you, Normal People is my favorite. I think it's fantastic. And I just love an Irish accent. Everything is in an Irish accent. It makes it better.
All right, I'll try audio.
I can't believe there's a particular book that hasn't been mentioned yet. So I'm curious to see, Russell, if it might be coming up.
I have two left.
I know, right? Oh my gosh. The anticipation. My next book is a vampire novel. I read some really good vampire novels this year. I ended the year with one called Lucy Undying, a Dracula novel. This is by Kirsten White. That was really great. I won't go into details because it's not actually on my list, but it was really close.
Oh, you just threw that in, you mean? It's not on your
Yeah,
list? Oh, wow.
I'm doing the
Okay.
Emily Fine way.
I just
Seems fair.
combined mine. I combined mine early. That's all.
Well, the book I'm going to talk about is The Gathering by C.J. Tudor. This came out in 2024 from Ballantine Books, and it was my favorite mashup novel because it's an investigation, mystery thriller, horror vampire novel. It's about a woman, Barbara Atkins, who's a vampire investigator, anthropologist, detective in a bit of a fantasy world in some ways. Vampires are a protected class in the United States. This takes place in a very small town in Alaska. There's been what appears to be a vampire murder, and she is sent up there to investigate because, again, vampires are a protected class. You can't just go and kill them, and the locals want to go and kill the vampires because the vampire colony that used to be just on the outskirts of town had left 20 years prior after a very similar murder. And what's interesting in this, I guess you would call it fantasy, is that in the United States, or in the land that is now the United States, there were the indigenous people, and then the vampires came. They kind of fled Europe. And then the white colonists came. The indigenous people and the vampires got along fine. There was enough territory, but as the whites moved in and started pushing people out, tensions arose. That's some of the backstory. But this detective, Barbara Atkins, she's middle-aged and overweight, and you get her backstory and you come to understand why she pushes people away. She's lost the love of her life, and she's on this investigation, and she does a very thorough job. You learn about her really interesting backstory, and then the backstory of some of the humans and some of the vampires. So what I liked is that it was very realistic, but with these twists on the vampire tropes. So again, that's The Gathering by C.J. Tudor. It's also a bit sapphic, although there's no love action.
I don't think I've ever heard the term love action before, but I will be using that from now on to describe so many things. I just want everyone to know that.
It's a great umbrella term, isn't it?
So I've done my Chris book. Now I have my Emily Fine book. I do think this will be a little bit of a challenge, but I do think that this is a book, Emily, that you would find a lot of reward from. And that is Small Rain by Garth Greenwell. This is a book that came out this year. This is Garth's third novel. All of his books are slightly like auto fiction, but this is about a man who is a poet. And at the start of the pandemic, he starts to have this uncontrollable pain in his abdomen, and he has to go into the hospital, and they can't figure out why. And he is stuck in the hospital during the pandemic. And it's all about us dealing with your sense of mortality. And it's all about how, as we get older, our bodies do things, and we have to sort of come to terms with what does this mean for the long term. And it's also a lot about our health system and what it lacks in sympathy and care. But at the heart of this book is the relationship that the main character has with his husband and how important that relationship is. And it's not the marriage relationship. It's just finding that person in your life that can help you get through the tough times and see the light at the end of the tunnel and not give up. His writing is really dense. He's not always the easiest read. Again, audiobook, he reads all of his books. He's got a fantastic reader voice. Again, he is a poet by trade. But the book just was so now, if that sort of makes sense. And, you know, as I'm getting older, my body starts to do things and I'm like, what the heck? Like, I thought that I was doing well, and now today I can't move this leg, you know? And it just made me sort of realize that that's what we all deal with. And sometimes society doesn't want to even notice that we're all getting older and we get ill, but we have to deal with it. And sometimes it's the relationships we have around us that make that easier. So it's beautiful. Like, it is beautiful. Small Rain, Garth Greenwell, highly recommend.
All right, I'm in. My pits got a little sweaty though when you were talking about that one. Like, that's a little stressful. And then I was also like, yeah, Russell's 10 years younger than us. Like, we're very familiar with parts of our body not working anymore.
You all have talked about short books. I have had a lot of chunky books this year. I've read A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, which, that was, I think, just over 500, baby book. And then Armadale by Wilkie Collins, which was like 800 pages. And then I read Moby Dick a couple times throughout the various, I did a buddy read and then 2 marathons. But I think I was most taken in by The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I have never read anything by Anne Bronte, and I adore this book so much. It was published in 1848, and it is a book that really shows domestic violence in a way that I've never read in a 19th century novel before. And I was just so surprised by it. So there's 3 sections. It's told through letters, so it's epistolary, and then there's diaries. So it starts with a man who is a farmer, kind of an educated farmer, who is really intrigued by this woman who comes to live in the community. She's living in a couple rooms of this old great hall. She's a widow. She's there with her young son, who's I think 4 or 5. And the whole town wants to know about her, but she's not giving up much information. There's an attraction between these two. And finally, she's like, oh, read my diary pages and then leave me alone. So then you jump from the letters where he's writing to a friend about the beginning situation. And then you get her diary, which is, again, another one of those stories about a teenage girl / young woman who is making decisions that the older adults around her fear, because she thinks she knows what she can do, that she can change this person, or that her piety, her goodness will help this other person. And so she makes a bad marriage. And you see the consequences of this and the escalation of her husband's alcoholism and wildness. He's part of the aristocracy, so kind of unlimited funds, although there are bills to be paid and everything. And just the wildness of these parties that they have, to the point where at one point the husband's like, who wants her? Anyone here can have her. And you think like, dear God, like in that day and age when a woman had no rights, didn't even have rights to her children or her money, certainly not to her body, how threatening that is. So pretty shocking. And then towards the end, it goes back to letters again. I hope that's not too much of a spoiler. I really love the writing. It just seemed pretty fresh and new. I think the only thing a modern contemporary reader would have to deal with is some of the piety, the religious Christian, I should say, aspects of it and her earnestness. But I've read enough 19th century fiction to understand that. And I didn't see much of an issue with that. But The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, it is a big chunkster, but it is so worth reading. And definitely make sure you read the 1848 edition and not the 1854, because as our listener Tina wrote in, that 1854 has missing parts because Anne's sister Charlotte didn't think this novel was appropriate. She thought the subject matter was a mistake. So thank you to Tina for alerting me to this issue, because I had been reading the Project Gutenberg e-version and the paper kind of bouncing back, and that Project Gutenberg is an 1854 edition and not the 1848. So important stuff there, because it leaves off the whole first letter that the male character is writing to his friend, which kind of sets up the structure for the book. It kind of made me think of one time I was in a book group, a Willa Cather book group, and we read My Antonia. And that book starts with the narrator talking about running to an old friend on a train and how they were both going to write their story about their friend Antonia. And one of the book club members, finally, when we were talking about it, she's like, what are you all talking about? She's like, who, what? I don't understand what you're saying. She's like, I feel like I've read a different book. Well, we found out that she had purchased a print-on-demand book that left off that introduction or preface. I forget what it's called. And so she didn't have that structure, and it made it a different novel. So important stuff to have the full book as the author intended it.
Yeah. Sister's getting in the way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think she's the older sister, and
Yeah.
she had this version of her sister, and also what is appropriate for back then, even today. I'm sure there are a lot of family members. You've talked about it, Emily, with some memoirs and stuff, like what is appropriate to write about,
Right.
whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and what that can do to family members.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right, drum roll, Russell.
Bring us home, Russell. What's your top?
My top book of 2024, I read in February, and it has remained my top book for the entire year. And that is James by Percival Everett.
Yes, that's the one I was hoping you were going to guess.
What a relief.
I know, right? I'm glad I met expectations here. I will say, so James by Percival Everett is, to me, a new modern American classic. I definitely think people will be reading it for generations to come. It is a retelling of the Huckleberry Finn story from the point of view of James, or Jim, the slave character. If you've read Huckleberry Finn, you sort of know what's going to happen, but Percival Everett does so much more with this story. He talks about race, he talks about slavery, he talks about family in such a nuanced, elegant way. James is so much more complicated than the worldview that he's been given in Huckleberry Finn. And he also plays with the idea of how the whites during this time had this idea of how everything was. And it was nothing like they thought. But because of their entitlement and what they felt the world was supposed to be like, they had no idea what was really going on. I just feel like that's the world in so many ways. This book is about Huckleberry Finn, James, all of that sort of stuff, but could be now. Like, it's so relevant to everything we deal with right now. I think Percival Everett, if you haven't read him, you're really missing out. He never writes the same book twice. He will challenge you. He will engage you. I just feel like James is going to be one of those books that we will remember until the end of time. James by Percival Everett. It's the best book I read this year.
Right on. I think we all three would have had it on our top 10, but
Yes.
thank you, Russell, for taking care of that.
I knew.
For us.
I thought for sure one of you would have it. So I'm glad that it was there, because I would have mentioned it.
Yes.
Had it not been, because I agree, Russell. I mean, I think it is a American classic now, and I don't think you can think of Huckleberry Finn now without James. I think it would be so fascinating to teach both of them side by side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people are doing companion reads. I didn't reread Huckleberry Finn. I just read James, but I know a lot of people are doing that. Yeah.
It's fascinating to see someone who is so capable to have a conversation with another author that's been dead so long and point out what Mark Twain did well, but also point out the holes in the story and add so much more texture to it all. I mean, I would just love an ounce of that talent. So, there you go. That was my top read of 2024.
Right on.
Amazing.
I appreciate your invitation. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully people like this list this year.
I think they will. And thank you so much, Russell. We always love talking with you. And we had listeners writing in and asking, is Russell going to be on again on your top 10?
Well, I'm very flattered. I appreciate you very, very much. And let's see what 2025 brings.
Yes,
Awesome.
for sure.
Yes.
And listeners, reminder that we want your top 10s. We're going to close the Google form on January 15th. So if you haven't filled it out, you still have time to do it. I've been looking at it. James is definitely up there in the top 10. So we'll see if there's any other crossovers from our lists. All right, everybody.
Happy reading. Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.